Commissioner Roberts,
Here.
Commissioner Husnick,
Here.
Commissioner Lorge,
Here.
Commissioner Erickson,
Here.
and President Bain.
Here, I'd like to invite everyone to rise and join us for the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Members of the EDA, we have an agenda before you this evening. I will entertain a motion to approve.
I move we approve the agenda.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Oppose? And our agenda is approved. First item this evening is to approve the minutes of our regular meeting from June 13th, 2022. I will entertain a motion or any changes that anyone would propose.
I motion that we approve the minutes for the regular meeting, June 13th. Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Oppose? And minutes are approved. And next we have minutes from the June 27th EDA Downtown Committee Workshop. And entertain a motion or any changes.
I move we approve.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor signal by saying aye. Oppose? And minutes are approved. And next on our agenda this evening is consideration of the recommendation to approve the downtown plan. And Dan, I think you're walking us through this.
I am President, members of the EDA. Enclosed in the packet was the draft final version of the downtown plan for the city of Forest Lake. This version of the plan does include a couple of small changes that were discussed during the June 27th Downtown Committee Workshop. A couple of those changes are, there was reference during the workshop that the picture on page 8 was an outdated picture. Bruce did go ahead and switch that up with a more current base map. We also added some clarifying language on the boat trailer parking as possible. It's a possibility as part of the boat ramp relocation analysis. So in the event that we can't relocate the boat ramp, we'll be looking at possibly relocating the parking. The language was there. We just added some clarification language on that to kind of strengthen that a little bit. And then also added some language about the addition of a teen or skate park to the Hardwood Creek Trailhead project. If you recall, during the open house that we had, there was quite a bit of discussion at the end of that regarding a teen park or some type of activity center for teens. And that also came up at Arts in the Park when they were looking at options for park planning. An option for teens was discussed there. So we put some language in there, just again, memorializing that in the downtown plan as part of that Hardwood Creek Trailhead project. There is one additional change that's not noted on here, that's not in the plan yet. On the acknowledgements page, I was going through this, and I noticed that there's no acknowledgement for the Washington County CDA Board for helping providing funding for this. I did reach out to HKGI, and we will get that added in for the final version once it's approved. But wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that we did receive funding from Washington County CDA to help make this plan possible as part of that. What staff is requesting tonight is looking for a motion to recommend to the Forest Lake City Council that they approve the downtown plan. It should be noted that this motion does not approve the funding sources or the funding of the plan, just the plan itself. So we're basically looking at approving the plan. We will come back with the funding recommendations at a later date. So we're not making a recommendation to approve the funding right now. It's just the plan itself this evening. The plan for approval of the downtown plan will, after tonight's meeting, we'll bring this to the Planning Commission as well as the Parks, Lakes, and Trails Commission at their July meetings for similar motions to recommend approval. And then we'll bring that back to the Forest Lake City Council on July 25th for their consideration and hopefully adoption of the plan on July 25th. So with that, staff is requesting a motion recommending that the Forest Lake City Council adopt the downtown plan. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions about this latest version or the process in general.
Thank you, Dan. Members of the EDA, any questions that we might have, clarifications, points of consideration that included as part of the plan? And then ultimately, staff is recommending a vote of recommendation to council to approve the plan. And I think that's coming up in 2 weeks at the next city council meeting. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
I have just maybe start discussion on any open discussion items. Dan, and there's been, so just a fair amount of kind of community feedback around, and kind of, I guess, as to be expected on, there's some projects that are anticipated as part of the plan that have some pretty big price tags and potentially some question around sources of revenue and the timing of those. What does the process look like as, assuming that the plan gets approved? Just can you give some color and clarification on what that process might look like as individual projects might come up for consideration? And I'm just looking for kind of the process that would give some assurance to those that are concerned that this is just carte blanche approval of a project spend of X number of dollars. So I'm looking for something to push back against that.
Yeah, well, I
What
think the
is that
public
process actually going
is
to be?
pretty aware, I think the public's pretty aware of the price tag of this plan at 35 million, and then inflation probably goes to 40 million. Obviously, in the past, this community hasn't had that kind of capital to invest. So before we even get to those larger projects, there may be some smaller projects we can figure out how to fund. But the larger projects will have to be a discussion with the EDA, with the council, on what the appetite is for funding these projects. And being that you have a very limited scope of how you can fund, you're basically looking at probably 3 to 4 different avenues that the council and EDA has to discuss. Obviously, we can talk a TIF district, but that has to pencil out to make sure that works right. It may or may not, depending on what that looks like. You can look at obviously issuing bonds for those projects and trying to slot them in a certain way that I would never recommend that you're going to do $35 million worth of bonds at the very beginning, because you're not going to have that kind of momentum and plan scope. So you do it every 4 years, every 5 years at $12 million or $6 million or whatever that might be. We've mentioned before the local sales tax, which is a possibility. You have the ability to, and that's definitely not a given nor a recommendation, nor is it locked in stone, because you have to, as you know, ask the legislature for permission to have a local sales tax, and then it has to go to a referendum. So there's a lot of steps with that. That's a 2-year process at least before you get to approval of that. But as was it about a year ago or so, maybe a little less, that we talked about a sales tax and what that might look like and why we would recommend it, if that's what we'd recommend, because we have more people shopping from out of town coming into Forest Lake than most other communities. So 40% of whatever you collect would basically be from out of town residents to fund redevelopment of your downtown. And very preliminary figures based on some of the studies we did through the university is a quarter, I believe it's a 0.5% sales tax would give you about $1.2 million to $1.4 million a year. So those are pretty much the only tools you have in your tool belt. That's going to take a lot of discussion and a lot of planning before we ever get there. Again, if it's a bonding situation, we have a lot of other projects that will compete for that. And as you all know, if you bond, it goes into a debt service, which then goes on to the property tax levy. So I think we have to come back to the EDA, then eventually the council, and try to figure out how we're going to slot that. And that's what the charge of the EDA is going to probably be for the next half year to a year, to try to figure out how this is all going to go. It's not going to be an easy task, nor is it going to be a quick task. So we just have to go through that.
And I think just to build off of that, and I think the EDA should be aware that once the plan is approved, it's not done. I mean, that's almost like the easy part of the whole process. Then the hard work has to come in. And that is, as we get a little bit further on the agenda with the 6 month, with the work planning, the downtown plan will stay on there. I mean, the approval part was going to be done, but a lot of that work will happen here in terms of prioritization, looking at budget numbers, bringing back recommendations. But at this point, the main thing was, are these projects still what's going to be included in the plan, so we can start looking at those total dollar bills? Because if you start shuffling those numbers around or adding or taking projects off, it does change the math. So looking at what's the field, and then from there, come back and start doing, rolling up the sleeves and sharpening the pencils and figuring out what is the best funding sources for these projects.
Also for clarity, of the price, kind of, there's high-level estimates at this point of total project price tags. Do those projects include, is a potential source of funding for those projects private investment, and those are partly covered with partnership dollars, or are partnership dollars included on top of? And so I use the classic example of, maybe we've talked about a redevelopment opportunity that might include some city parking. And obviously that redevelopment opportunity is going to include some private funding. The numbers that are included in the plan, would those include, are those only the city's share, expected to be only the city's share, or is that included to be an all-in, of which there might be multiple
What's
funding
included in
sources?
the plan, and Dan, you can take over, but what's included in the plan is really only the expenditure side of it. It's not including any revenue with the public-private partnership or total private redevelopment. So if we haven't really looked at the revenue or figured out where we're going to go, but that would have to be included in some of those tasks. And that doesn't include, if we need to have land acquisition, or what the expense of some of these bigger projects might be if there's a expansion of the scope of what that might be, or an opportunity. And one of the things that Bruce talked about is an opportunistic taking. Maybe that comes down the road, and then we have to switch course or get creative and figure out how we're going to make that opportunistic happen. So no, we don't have any private dollars yet into the plan. That's again part 2 of the plan, which Dan says the more difficult side is how we're going to fund this.
And I think to that breakdown point as well, Bruce is working on a sources and uses document to accompany this. It's kind of, I'd say, provides some guidance in terms of where can you be partnering, leverage dollars. It's not going to be like the total roadmap to get there, but it's going to provide his expertise in terms of how some of these partnerships have worked in the past. We don't have that document yet. It also should be noted too, like a lot of times when you do a downtown plan, the CIP portion, or talking about the funding side, is typically not included. One of the reasons why HKGI was selected was they were going to give us that capital improvement, the planning, the dollar side of it. So we knew when it was approved, we had an idea of what we were getting into. Not saying that we're committed to it, but at least we sort of have an idea that if you wanted to do all this, this is a dollar cost. Other planning firms will give you the pictures, but they won't tell you how much it costs. I think that's the benefit of HKGI, is because we do have those costs associated with the projects, even though they are estimates at this point.
That's maybe I'm glad we have a plan that has some high-level costs, but I think by including high-level costs, it sends a message that those projects are further down the pipe than they might be. And maybe that's just something that we need to just continue to repeat, that these are estimated costs on estimated individual projects, should we choose to in the future go down as a city those estimated projects or individual projects. Other points of question or clarifications, or Jenny, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Sam.
Oh, I was just going to say that, the whole thing is a work in progress, and this is not cut in stone. I want the public to know that. We can certainly adjust things, but also you have to have some kind of a plan, some kind of a blueprint, because if somebody's going to do any kind of development down there, they're going to have some sense of direction of where this thing is going, and that's where they become a partner in this whole thing. And so we can make it happen, great, but you got to start out with a blueprint someplace along the line, and we can certainly modify it as we go. So
I just wanted to thank the citizens of Forest Lake that did participate in the planning process, and letting the voices be heard and their neighbors be heard. Everything's been taken into consideration, and a lot of man hours have been put into this plan. I just want to thank the public.
Very well said. Agree. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, and I don't know who, this probably would be more of a question for Ryan, but so a lot of this, I think an easy part to start would be on the streetscape thing, cost-wise and just time. If it goes nowhere with the county on the turnback do you see any path forward of doing anything close to what we want to do here if it remains MnDOT right away?
Well, I think if it remains MnDOT, we're going to have a lot of discussions with MnDOT and what we want to do, and if they will accept narrowing the roads to have more parking or more sidewalk space. So again, I think we all understand what that involves. So I think there's a chance. It's just, again, that's why we have a plan, and I think that's the good part, is that we go to MnDOT and we say, look, here's what the vision looks like. We have some kind of renderings. What's it going to take us to get there? So at least they have an idea what we're talking about, instead of walking in the room and says, well, we kind of want to do this, we kind of want to do that. At least there's a plan. So if there's no turn back, then it's obviously probably more of a protracted discussion with MnDOT. You know, I'll never say never, but it's worth, I think there's a possibility we can get
Can you
there.
remind us of the time frame with the county and where we're at again? I know we've talked about it a number of times, but just remind.
The county has just issued a study for the turnback of 61. I don't think I'm not sure if they've got a consultant on board yet. I think the RFP actually went out on the street is where they're at. Or they've got the consultant hired, one of the two. So it's in a very, very preliminary stage, and I don't know what the time frame of that is. So we'll try to get some more information, maybe update you there, but it's really preliminary and it's really early in that process.
I would add to that whether it's MnDOT at the table or Washington County at the table, individual projects are going to have similar questions related to streetscape and related to access to 61. And so us taking that role as the city and being more planful might help it might get some attention, recognizing that if in absence of having a city approach, they're going to have an individual project approach as each of those projects come up. So I think there's some motivation on the other part of whoever it is, recognizing that there's some significant opportunity for redevelopment, and so let's take a citywide view rather than individual block by block. Thoughts around, so just a couple comments on next steps here. So staff's looking for a recommendation or a vote from EDA tonight, which would be to recommend to council that they approve. And then there are meetings between now and the city council meeting in 2 weeks with the Planning Commission and Parks, Trails and Lakes Commission, where we will be similar presentation, gathering their feedback and making a similar ask. And the goal is that we would have kind of a vote of recommendation going into that city council meeting. So just make sure that we've kind of included all different voices from each of our different boards and commissions. And I think that's valuable feedback that council will be looking for. So we've had some touch points along the way. So this is kind of the capstone of each of those conversations.
I just want to thank city staff for all the hours you guys put into this, being the liaison with the consultant. I mean, I think we've got a robust plan that gives us a very clear blueprint for private development, or even, you know, as a city that has had a lot of public input, a lot of touch points and opportunities for the citizens to have a voice, which I think, you know, there's, having been a part of the constant changing of the drafts, you know, I think our consultant took it to heart to implement that. So yeah, it's good output.
Excellent. Anybody, any further comments, or anybody ready to make a motion?
Make a
Okay.
motion that we
Go ahead.
approve the plan and make a recommendation to council to approve.
Excellent. There's a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? Echo all of the comments and thanks to both staff and all of our boards and commission members that have spent a lot of time in a lot of meetings, as well as the public, in kind of getting us to this point. So happy to support it this evening. Any other discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Oppose? And motion is approved. All right. Well, that's a great transition then into Dan, 2022 work plan update.
President, members of the EDA, actually the next two items sort of go, they kind of dovetail into each other. I felt it was probably a good idea at this point, since we've been really heavily focused on the downtown plan, is to take a brief moment to sort of just recap where we are in the overall work plan for the EDA, give a 6-month update on the 2022 EDA work plan, and then just sort of look ahead and do next 6-month look ahead as what's coming kind of down the pipeline based than where we currently sit. If you recall, back in January of this past year, the EDA established a 6-month work plan rather than a 2-year update. There was 2 reasons for that. First reason was that we were working on the downtown plan and knew that was going to be approved and take a lot of the effort for the first half of the year on the downtown plan. But then also, we're also at that point actively looking for a community development director and wanted to make sure that the new hire for the community development director had input on, you know, what the EDA was going to be doing into the future. So we set up a 6-month work plan and focused primarily on just 3 items. First was the complete the downtown planning process, begin work on the policy review of the tax abatement, business subsidy, TIF programs, and update those policies as needed. And then also to continue this efforts in the Minnesota Technology Corridor by actively marketing the Headwaters 123 as part of that corridor update. I think we're fairly well aware of the work that we've done on the downtown plan. That has been the primary driver as to what we've been doing here for the past 6 months. We have done a little bit of work. I started the work on the the policy review for the business subsidy abatement and TIF programs. If you recall, I believe it was back in February or March, there was sort of the introduction to business subsidy programs that was presented. That is about as far as we've gotten there. I would like to kind of reboot that moving forward here to get those policies updated in the second half of 22, with the goal of starting in 23 with updated policies and new programs in place. So those really will dovetail nicely with the new downtown plan as that starts to bring development in. The incentive programs will also be ready to go at that point, where if a developer comes in and asks, what's your TIF policy? Here's a policy for that. What's the incentive policy? Here's a policy for that. So then they can go back and start looking at, does my project meet these criteria that are there? It's a great starting point from when a developer comes in. If you can hand them something that says, here's the pathway, or how we utilize incentives or business subsidies within the city. On the Headwaters 123, there has been quite a bit of work that has been done on this. It has not really been communicated out, again, since we've been primarily focused on the downtown plan. I did present at the spring, back in May, at the Minnesota Real Estate Journal's, I think it was Land Development Summit. I did a focus on the Minnesota Technology Corridor there and really highlighted that the Headwaters parcel. We've also been working with Dan Peterson on looking at the listing to make sure is technology still the right sector for that parcel. As we all know, industrial land has been a pretty hot market segment in the past probably 6 to 12 months. And then asking him to make sure, because obviously when we signed up with Dan Peterson, it was not tech exclusively. It was, looking at that, trying to create jobs, creating a job center for the city of Forest Lake. So looking at making sure that, while we're still in the tech market, but are we also at this point, is he marketing that in the industrial segment as well? And based on that meeting, he is saying that he is looking at sort of any and all uses for that particular parcel. So while we're still primarily in the tech sector, he's also looking at industrial uses for that parcel as well. I will also reach out to Dan and have him come back in and have him present the market update to the EDA directly, because he obviously knows more details about the actual market since that's his level of expertise. But I'll have him come in the second half of 22 to present the market updates. Along with the technology corridor, if you recall back in last November, we had Excipio come in and present on a study option for doing basically sort of a pretty in-depth study on the parcel to see where does fiber come in, what is the return on investment from a development standpoint if it does develop as a data center, and then also how do we split down the parcel if it doesn't develop for the full 123 of 40 acres, what is needed for a data center, what's the most prime 40 acres, then we can make decisions on, possibly looking at, do we want to market it, as a smaller chunk to try to get a land that way. If you recall, at the end of last year, my contact at Excipio retired, and I was introduced to a new contact there. I'm still waiting to hear back. I did meet with him in the beginning of the year. I told him wait until summer based on their book of business. They were pretty booked up. We're supposed to reconnect here at some point over the summer months to get kind of a status update there. But as I've been waiting for that call, I did also have a conversation with Dan, just saying, from a return on investment standpoint, how good are these from a, if we invest the money in a study, do we get a good return on those? And, he said that they're not they're not sort of the silver bullet. He said anybody who's going to come in to do that type of study will probably do their own analysis. Not that they don't trust our numbers, but they want to run their own modeling on the site. Additionally, Centerville completed one of these studies, I believe it was last year. So some of those incentives that are available to a data or to a text center that's coming in are more state-driven. So those numbers would transfer over to a site here. So he was saying, he goes, it's not going to hurt the listing by having it done. He just was not 100% convinced you're going to see a huge return on that investment. So I'm still waiting to hear back from Excipio in terms of, kind of if they even have capacity within this year to do it, but also evaluating if return is going to be there. Because I think that's a key component in terms of if you want to authorize those studies, is to make sure that return is going to be there. So a little bit more to be determined on that one, but there has been work sort of continue those conversations, keep those relationships going on the Headwaters parcel.
What's the price tag on that Excipio study again?
I believe it was right around 20,000. And there is a funding opportunity there where we could go for a pre-development grant application with Washington County. So we could potentially get that down to 10, because that'd be a 50-50 match. And then also I could see if there's any other private dollars that would be available from within the corridor to help fund that study. It was just sort of, and asking, the broker's kind of professional opinion on it kind of was, and again, he wasn't saying it was bad. He was just kind of saying, he goes, if you have limited dollars to spend, he goes, it's not, he was sort of 50-50 on the effect of it.
Well, I mean, go ahead.
Well, this question, I feel like the fellow that came in and did the presentation, one of the impressions I got was that he had relationships. And so, I mean, is there still some value there with the new person that maybe that guy or that person took with him when he retired? Or, because it seemed like another lead source in a sense.
And that's a great point. That is exactly when Jeff was here, you basically, I mean, you were getting the study, but you're also getting another marketing opportunity because he marketed those sites as he went out and sort of did the junket. He was always speaking on different, shows and all over the upper Midwest. And I don't know if our replacement is as active in the market as Jeff was. And so when Jeff left, there was sort of did that Rolodex go with him? I haven't confirmed that the new one has the same level of Rolodex or the same level of engagement within the market as Jeff did.
I know we're not making final decisions, but as I just hear priorities and think about broader needs within Forest Lake and broader kind of needs that the EDA should be focused on. The Headwaters parcel continues to be important, but we've spent a lot of time already on studies and data, and we have a lot that's already in the can. I'm just of the things we could do, further investment there on something that's pretty specific. I feel like we're getting very, very specific on a parcel that may continue to be a long-term hold for us, and I'm just nervous on whether that's a good
I'd be
next step.
curious to know what the shelf life of that study is.
And then that's something too, I don't know how long those last. I mean, it could depend if the Minnesota is sort of, if their investment, if the state's investment in technology stays relatively steady, I think they have a decent shelf life. But I don't know if it's 6 months, a year, 2 years. I don't know that off the top of my head. We also, we did ask, Dan kind of point blank, if, what does he recommend in terms of if another study were to come down, what would he see sort of some of that, good return on investment would be. And, one thing he had suggested was possibly doing, I'm going to call it a ghost plat over there to see, if you're going to break this down into smaller chunks, here's a couple of options, what it would look like. Kind of a, remember when Commissioner Finneman was here, we did small area planning for a little bit, kind of just put some, sketches on the parcel, maybe a little bit more level of detail on there than what, Commissioner Finneman did. But one of the reasons for that is that when you bring that out to an end user, they can then look at that site and say, okay, I take 40, here's what the rest of it would look at. So they can start to, so there maybe not be as, kind of apprehensive about just taking a portion of it. They can kind of see there's a plan for the remaining pieces that are there, and they may buy two. But again, that's sort of a double-edged sword, because as we're seeing in the Twin Cities real estate market, larger contiguous tracts are becoming a rarer and rarer commodity. You know, a lot of those cities like Cottage Grove, which had a number of them, they're now full. They have no more developable large tracts of land, which is going to put that need somewhere else. And, you know, our piece of that property is getting market traction. I mean, we're getting, you know, we're still getting pinged with inquiries on it. So, you know, it's one of those things where, is it worth additional study, or can we just hold it and see what comes through?
And Dan, my perspective has been that more of the inquiries that you've gotten have been on larger, we've seen more interest in larger projects than smaller projects, right? Is that?
Yeah, that's a fair assumption. I mean, there's been some, you know, realtor-based questions that always come in for smaller 5, 10 pre-existing sites. But where we've been competitive in probably the past 3 years are on those larger sites that are, they're looking for 80 acres, 100 acres. And when those come in, we continuously we stay in the game longer than we used to on those inquiries that come in. This also has awareness with deed. Right now, deed is very aware of our site. So when they go out and they're getting inquiries that come in, our name is mentioned there. And I do know a few national firms that, you know, develop land nationally have, you know, been impressed with what we've done so far to the site. You know, I can't name any names, but they've been saying, you know, they know that we're here to, you know, that we're a serious contender for development. So a lot of that groundwork that we've done, I think we've planted a very good field in terms of what can come out of that site.
I'm just curious, the listing agent for the property, what is his marketing strategy? Who's he marketing to, or is he referring it all to the city?
So he actually is the main point. So he actually is very well connected within the technology data center sphere. That's sort of that's where he focuses his energies. But he does, we don't just get him, he's got other partners. They do talk, you know, at CBRE, they do have sort of a meetings. I don't know if they're weekly, but they talk about listings. So if any project is coming in, we're not just exclusively in technology. That broker set's a pretty small group, and they do market those internally around. So while we're focused on his expertise is technology, it's not being done at the expense of the industrial segment or the warehousing segment. We're in all of those markets as well at this point.
When do you want further, like where does this fit as far as next consideration, or specifically to Excipio? It sounds like Dan will come in to kind of give us an overview of the 123 site. I've kind of drug us down this Excipio rabbit hole in this conversation, but are you kind of, where does that fit in, like us making a decision on next steps for that?
I think what I want to do is have one more conversation with my contact there, just to kind of get a feel for his involvement in the industry, to see if there's some value add there. And then also just, you know, touch base with them in terms of, you know, do they have capacity? You know, because if this is something we have capacity for 22, you know, the market could completely change by 23, and we could be looking at a different, you know, because it seems like 3 or 4 years ago, tech was the darling of the industry, and now it's industrial, and now it's going to be warehousing. So it's sort of, you're kind of on some level, I don't want to say chasing the flavor of the month, but you want to make sure that when that does change, that you're ready to pivot with it. And, you know, I'll reach out to my contact at Excipio and see where that lands.
I guess I would just put that potential investment against some of we've got some studies that are identified as part of the downtown plan, and maybe that we decide takes the higher priority. Okay.
And to be fair, when I look at when RFIs come in for the parcel, when I've had to go through that process of presenting what we have, I don't see at this point a lot of really glaring misses or anything that we're totally missing in terms of that parcel. If you're looking at extremely large scale development that come into that particular site, you know, an AUAR, you know, might be advantageous, but that sort of takes a look at, you can get a very large user in there, and that can expedite the environmental review side of a project. So that will keep you in the game a little bit longer, because time for approvals is, you know, critical for those projects. That's probably the one miss that I see, is in having maybe some of that pre-environmental work done or an AUAR done for that area. That sort of gets outside of just that one parcel, creates a little bit larger study area.
Yeah, that interceptor line that runs across there, is that being an issue, I mean, with marketing that property, or it hasn't so far?
Hasn't so far, but it can very well be one because
mean, it's
it's
pretty much
it's straight. It's 36 inch, 36
But I mean,
inch
it's
interceptor.
pretty much divides the property is what I'm getting
Yeah,
at.
it does. It does, and we've had
You know,
some discussions with a couple of the interested developers about that and whether it could be moved or whether it could be built over or whether it can just be a parking lot over it. So in the long run, probably if I had to guess, sooner or later we'll have to have it moved at our cost. That's my guess, really. We've already had talks with the council regarding that and how that would work. Probably a $2 million price tag.
But maybe
A
if it was
$2
an
million
industrial
price
complex, they could adjust to it rather than,
Yeah, I mean, what the Met Council pretty strongly said is they don't want concrete over the top of that pipe. And if there is concrete over that pipe, they'll have to move it. So,
yeah. That answers my question anyways, but
Is there, are we getting, so this, I assume we're mainly talking developers for commercial, but are you getting inquiries on residential for that at all?
not on that property, no.
Not for that parcel.
Okay.
No, it's more the industrial and
Okay.
technology sectors at this point.
So no other, like, you know, I forget his name, the gentleman, Jamie,
Mr. Jensen.
Jens, yeah, so you not heard from him or any other, that, you know, since he was,
No, we've had a number of inquiries on housing developments and different parcels. It's just not that large parcel.
Also, just lots of housing in other parts of the, you know, we've kind of seen the headwaters area around it, yeah. I have kind of taken us maybe a little off track of your planned discussion, Dan, of just overall kind of work plan update.
Yeah, and this is the last piece on there was the downtown plan. You know, now that we have the motion to recommend approval, you know, would be spend time in the back half of 22, really starting to dive into sort of the execution side of it. Because as we mentioned in the past, you kind of go through the planning phase and you don't want to put that plan on the shelf and just have it sit there. You want to actually start accomplishing the goals that are in that plan. So, you know, spending time between now and the end of the year, really starting to get that execution plan more identified and start looking at, you know, having some of those conversations on funding strategies, et cetera. So that's a little bit of a look ahead, you know, in terms of where we've been and also a little bit as to, you know, potentially where we're going to go here for the back half of 22. You don't want to speak for Abby, but I would say probably recommend in the beginning of 23 is restarting and I'll get it back on the 2-year work plan cycle and just sort of use 22 as a, you know, shore up some of the planning activities that we've done with the downtown plan and the, you know, policy work and then, you know, hit it in 23. But again, that all being said, the other items that are included on that previous work plan, there is still work that's being done on those. I mean, like in terms of workforce development, working to get a meeting set with Washington County's workforce coordinator to have an update there, still active with the career launch program. So those other items aren't just sitting there, not having anything done to them. There's still some work happening in the back, you know, kind of behind the scenes on those as well. But primary EDA focus will be, you know, like I said, Headwaters 123, you know, getting the downtown, you know, plan, you know, teed up for execution, and then also the business incentive policy, the back half of 22.
I think, do you want, is it worth some, like another level of discussion related to some of the more specific items to come out of the downtown plan? Do you want some feedback on that now, or do we want to wait until that thing is finally all the way through council approval?
I mean, my recommendation is wait till all the way through council approval. I mean, just, you know, I don't anticipate any major hiccups between now and then, but I'm sort of at the point where once everything's done and it's approved and adopted, the planning window is closed and we can start really focusing on the adoption or the execution side of it.
I think to that point, but also informative of things that we might want to consider for the 2023 budget. I think there's a couple of planning activities that we'll want to jump to the top of the list. Streetscapes, planning with streetscapes and planning for the study around the boat launch are two that come to mind, but we can go further on that at another time. Those seem like portions that are going to be city-led that because of some partnership need and involvement of other jurisdictions that we'll need to, if we want those to move, we'll have kind of to drive that down the field sooner rather than later.
And I think if everybody's okay, maybe that use that as a segue sort of into the drivers for 2023 budget.
Actually, before we do that, any other work plan kind of feedback items?
I'm just looking at page 90, looking at page 95, where staff attended the East Metro Development Summit in August. I'm assuming you're talking about 21, right?
Yeah, the update that was in the downtown, in the actual plan, that was last year's year-end update. So I've been going to those Metro summits there wasn't one specifically for East Metro. Each one of these conferences does attract a different group of brokers. So even though the presentation materials stay relatively the same, the audience does change.
All right. Good segue to budget driver discussion.
President was at the EDA. Just kind of want to have a high level discussion on the operating budget for the EDA. As we mentioned, sort of the capital improvement budget or the CIP plan for the downtown plan will kind of be a separate, item, but this is more on the, the operating budget, sort of the day-to-day work that the EDA does, for next year. We did, last year have one of these conversations again in July. Are there any initiatives that, the EDA is looking at that's not funded, that's currently not being looked at, that we want to explore? Just so we can start, putting some numbers together for the 23's budget. Just to recall some of the drivers that we looked at for 22 that I think transfer over to 23. We did a chamber BR&E agreement, at the end of, actually the beginning of, end of 21 for 22. And during the renewal portion of that, there was some conversation of possibly expanding services with the chamber. And as such, that possibly would include, increasing the amount of money that contract is, that we spend on that contract. Just a reminder that what we spend on 2022 was $5,000 for the services rendered. I know there was, quite a bit of discussion about that. Do we want to expand that? Do we want to, increase what we're expecting? And also then at that point, increase the funding level for that. So that was one of the drivers, that I identified from 22 that transfers over to 23. Additionally, the downtown incentive, if you recall, we did increase the level of funding for the downtown incentive for 22 to 30,000. Two reasons was that we're looking at expanding the overall, businesses that would qualify based on the geographic area from just downtown to basically almost all of Forest Lake, and then also adding in that tiered structure as well. So far to date, we've had one formal application approved. I've had two other inquiries recently, and I believe another one just came in, not too terribly long ago. So we're actually looking at 3 other applications that are coming in, and it should be noted that those applications, we have not really done any formal marketing outreach or formal push, on that. That's been sort of organically driven to come back in. In the event that in 22 we don't spend the full $30,000, those excess funds would stay within the EDA's fund balance and then would be used to grow sort of that incentive, the bucket that we could use for larger projects or for incentives in the future. So that was sort of, if there's a demand in one year for those dollars, we'd expend them, but if for a year we don't spend the full 30,000, the remaining 10, 15, 20 would stay there, grow the fund balance. So if we do have a bigger project that comes in, we would be able to potentially have that cash on hand for an incentive at that point. So we recall we spent 30,000 that was budgeted there. Just again, looking at the conversation, you want to keep that funding level there. Any desire to increase that? Where does EDA sort of sit there? And then just a couple other possible initiative or drivers. Support for workforce recruitment and retention strategies. As I've mentioned before, this is probably one of the biggest issues that most communities are facing, most businesses are facing right now, is attracting and retaining talent. It's also, when I present at the development summits and have talked to people in the industry, it's also the one that's probably the toughest in the public sector to really get our arms around, which is why I'm reaching out to Washington County's workforce. We recently reconnected and was sort of hey, is there any way, what are the communities doing? What can we do to assist there? I don't necessarily know that there's a funding need for that in terms of like, what's going to be required from a funding standpoint, but more probably of a support standpoint. How do we support those, recruitment and retention efforts? Because if you can, it's great that you can build the employment base here, but if you don't have the workers to fill those jobs, that can be a challenge. Additionally, looked at labor market assessment.
Before you move on from that, is there something that we can do one of the questions that always comes in is what is our available workforce? And we have some, I think some numbers that kind of show whether we are an importer or an exporter of jobs, right? Is there more work that could be done there that would paint the picture of available workforce? And is potentially that part of what Washington County might be considering? And I know when Chris Eng was here last, he was talking about potentially doing like a North Washington County, Mid Washington County, South Washington County study of exactly that question. That's just something that I think is a common ask, and we struggle sometimes to have that data at the amounts, but then also skill sets and some of the income requirements and some of those things that a robust study might provide. Is that part of what we might be in an assistance role or maybe leaning on a Washington County?
Yeah, to that point, I mean, I have spoken with Chris. The county is looking at doing that in early 23. I was looking at doing a labor shed study, similar to the Chisago County one that was presented here, kind of in the same vein. They're looking at breaking it down North Washington County, kind of Mid Washington County, then Southern Washington County, because I think all of them, we look at them, are going to have different labor sheds and different recruitment. Like we're going to be able to get northern and kind of more central, kind of pull some of Chisago probably, through here. That's not going to be accessible down in Southern Washington County. At this point, they're looking at trying to fund that themselves and not have an ask there. But I think as a fallback, that if they don't, or they're not able to fund that, possibly, there's been kind of preliminary conversations with Chris about, is that something that we could potentially do for a pre-development grant? Because I know it's not specific to a property, but it does give us that data set where somebody comes in and says, what's your labor shed look like? We can show what Forest Lake's labor shed looks like, especially now that we have Chisago counties to the north. We can really start to get a pretty good picture of what this whole area kind of brings, from a labor perspective, because if you put an employment center here, yes, you're going to pull from within the community, but you're also going to pull from Chisago County. You're also going to pull from Western Wisconsin. And part of Chisago's study does pull those areas in, and they probably reach a little further out into central Minnesota than our study would. So you start to get a bigger picture of what Forest Lake can recruit, which is, kind of the benefit of being right on the county line is that, when you have that, you share a county line, you're going to be able to, that study is applicable to us, but probably not so much so for somebody in Southern Washington County. So the studies they're looking at funding them at the county level with no participation required from the local municipalities. That's not a guarantee at this point, but it's something I think that we should continue to have on the radar screen, because if for some reason funding doesn't materialize at the county, it may be worth looking at potentially just going out and doing one for Forest Lake, just because there is quite a bit of value there from an employer standpoint to have that labor shed study done.
Yeah, I think it's a topic that's just challenging for us. We're just a small piece in this large labor market, and it's tough for individual cities to kind of the resources to study, manage, all of the above. So.
I've asked other people, who work in the public sector. I said, if you figure out the silver bullet for this, let me know, because we are all sort of looking at each other saying, it's kind of that blending line of like, where does the public sector interface with the private sector, and what can you do? Because you can't force people into certain industries. So it's sort of correct. It's a tough nut to crack, but.
Well, and it begs also the question on who's going to be the user of it, because our current employers already know, right? They know what their recruitment, shed looks like, and where they're successful and where they struggle. And so you're really looking at providing that to new employers, and larger organizations are going to do their own study, to your previous point, and so it's kind of this question on who's the user of it and are we the best provider of that data, so.
Well, if we're marketing that land to light industrial, I mean, would it be of value
Correct.
to attract those
Correct.
employers?
And I think that the Commissioner Erickson's point, that is, having a current leadership study, if you're going to the table with somebody coming in from a warehousing, light industrial standpoint and saying, the overall market from, Chisago County and Northern Washington County can support X number of warehousing jobs, that labor force is here based on, these Cushman and Wakefield studies. I think there is value there because, they can see then, while they may do their own analysis, that at least says, yes, this one does pass that initial test in terms of, as a possible site for them to locate at. And then the last thing I have on, in terms of other possible initiatives, was there'd been some conversation about, a resource packet for local small businesses, it's sort of kind of connecting the dots for some of those, local businesses. They had to get them some assistance there. So there was some conversation about, the creation of a resource packet, for those local businesses as well. So that's a little bit of what I had for 23, operating budget drivers. Opening up at this point for any, feedback on that, anything that was missed, anything that, needs to be added to that, that you want me to take a look at before we bring back sort of that first draft budget in the next couple of months, in the near future.
Is there a follow-up study already approved for HKGI? Is that in here?
HK,
The consultant on the downtown plan, didn't we do like a supplemental agreement for the southeast quadrant?
for 22, this would be for 23, so this would be for next year's operating budget.
There be any need to line item something for that, or do we not anticipate any further?
I think there's going to be, there is some need for follow-up studies, as a result of the plan.
Yeah, and whether that service provider is HKGI or there's somebody else, but I think, certainly the boat launch has questions around further study with the boat launch, and certainly around streetscapes, and some of those individual projects certainly have a study phase that we should be considering for that 2023.
And those projects have been budgeted to account for design engineering study. So the boat launch, boat parking is its own study, but let's say it's a streetscape beautification project, that total dollar amount that you see includes some of that study. I think Leif is asking maybe about just that line item for planning services. The plan does call for needing some planning services continuously. I think that first year you probably would be first couple of years might be kind of limited on that, just because we'll be initiating some of those projects in the next couple of years. But as we kind of start to vet out the plan and work through it, there might be a need to bring them back in for modifications or updates or those sorts of things.
I would like to make sure we look at the chamber agreement, possibly increasing that.
Yes.
So I'd like us to look at that.
Okay.
Along those lines, just planting some seeds, as we look at the increased funding, I think part of the question is also what does that go for, or what does that go towards? And so I think there's two sides of that. One is the funding side, and then the other is the scope of services, and just what is that? And I think I'm sure the chamber has a number of things that they would propose to be part of that, and that's part of the conversation we should have. Other things on the wish list for 2023 to start planting some seeds from a budget standpoint?
I've just got a question of clarification. Is New Tracks now totally funded by the city and not the EDA?
Yes.
These are kind of just long-term, not even long-term or short-term, but minor things, but and it goes something, I don't know, if it was part of the EDA originally, but I know the Lions were involved with it, but our banners are starting to fall apart and that. So I think if we can reach out to both Rotary and Lions and see if they're interested in doing something. If not, I think we need to
I
budget
would
that
agree.
for next year for sure.
I would also kind of put in short-term streetscape items. We do continue to have certain areas of streetscape that are less than ideal, and some short-term improvement would be helpful. I just happened to walk through the park yesterday and noticed that the median in the parking lot of the park is a wheat bed of just, and there's areas like that that are just part of city median or city places that are probably less than ideal.
Cityscape. This is another small item, but as long as you're writing down things, if you can, if we have like a small miscellaneous fund, a small step, inexpensive step we could take for the downtown plan is, could we put up some bike racks nearby the trail where people could lock up their bike and walk into town, and do that now rather than wait 5 years down the line?
That's been discussed before in the past. And
What happened to it?
nothing, that's the
Oh.
problem with it. Yeah, but it's a great idea. I mean, that's something we've been wanting to do for quite some time. We just, for whatever reason, it gets lost in the process, so.
My son and his girlfriend now have e-bikes, so they're on the trail all the time, but they can't leave their bike to go into a restaurant. They tried it and they were petrified. They're parked by the window watching their bikes. So it'd be nice if we had something.
That's a great point. As one who's cycled through town quite a bit, our cycling infrastructure, once you get off, even on the trail, is a little bit lacking. So it's a great point.
It also might be a good county may have some low-hanging fruit dollars for, especially if we're gonna do it right along the trail.
Land acquisitions on this part of this downtown project, is that something you would see would be funded through the EDA? Or is that strictly city? Yeah, I look at that piece of property, the Rubes Tire, the Stark block, the city already owns a little small portion of that where the water treatment plant is. And looking at this plan, the aerial view of the downtown, that block just looks prime to be able to maybe pick up. I know that there's some discussions with on the Hool site about selling some city-owned land there. Can some funds be transferred in somewhere to buy other properties from those funds, that proceeds that we get? I don't know if that's something that's
Yeah,
possible or not.
if you wanted to buy, in that particular case, we would have to figure out how that was going to be financed, whether it was, if it's through EDA, which has used its bonding authority in the past, so it's a possibility, again, all of it is depending on how much it is and where the debt service gets paid out of, so. And if it's mostly, I don't see us having another funding source on that type of thing besides bonding or TIF, or again, the sales tax or public-private partnerships, but again, it's a good idea that we should be looking, that's the stuff we should be looking at.
And that, the reason I'm bringing it up right now is just based, if we're looking for putting money aside, I don't know if there's a small item and just to look, and I hate to use another study, but to have some funding to allow to look into doing that, and if that's an EDA-driven project or not. And the other piece was, part of the plan is that vacant spot there, just, for where they talked about the bikes coming off the trail, and I don't forget that what it's called in here, but, just things to think ahead of.
I mean, I think that's the first steps of the downtown plan, is to identify some of those. And it's not that they're huge or small, but those kind of things we may be able to pick off quicker
Land acquisition
than
priorities.
others.
And maybe it's that having a conversation. I know it gets really awkward when publicly we're talking about other people's land without having a conversation with them. But I think that, knowing the Starks, I don't think they really have an exit strategy there as far as the business, and they're Mr. Stark's probably ready to retire, so maybe it's just a conversation. He has those 1 or 2 homes just to the west of that commercial piece, and I think that would just be, as far as a prime spot for boat trailer parking, with just having to cross 61, just seems like a really, at least something to explore, pretty strong.
And at least to have the conversation initially to see what their timeline might look like, and if there's even mutual interest. Because if it's not mutual interest, there's a much different answer, so.
I know when we did we sold the land, the City Hall land, they didn't have any interest in doing anything then. And that's why it's still, you know, they wanted, I think, Gone would have taken that. They would have been, but maybe it just wasn't priced, but I don't think he was quite ready to hang up the tire business yet.
Also 7, 8,
Right, it's been a while.
9, 10 years ago? Yeah, a while ago.
Where would the boys have coffee?
Right, yeah.
There was like 18 of them in there today, so.
Correct.
Facetious, but it's, yeah, not, well, I think it's a good idea. I mean, not sure exactly where Dick is coming from, because he's 80, you know, I'd be gone in a heartbeat if, you know, if I had the opportunity, but I think we should explore it, I really do.
Any other questions or thoughts related to planning? So Dan, just want to make sure I understand timing for next steps. So this kind of comes back in an August meeting, specifically around kind of operating budget. And then, because just refresh of process, operating budget is impacted and funded through the general fund. We need to pass a preliminary levy for that budget in September. Numbers can go down after September for general fund, but they can't go up. And then we would have through the end of the year to do things that are capital improvement or kind of CIP capital projects that would not have a need for a 2023 general fund. We can do that between now and the end of the year and still have it be included as part of a 2023 budget. But anything that's going to require cash out the door for 2023 really needs to be on a pretty solid punch list, or at least a wish list for September. Again, we can always skinny it back. We just can't make it bigger after September. So.
Yeah, anything this requires bonding or capital improvement or even a capital purchase, since the levy has to be set, which also includes the general fund, does include the general fund, but it's also the capital fund, the street fund, the EDA fund, all of it will be set in September. So we have to be aware of what kind of expenditures we may be looking at in '23.
One last thing then, thinking about deadlines and making sure you get everything in there. When you're looking at buying in the future, somebody who's ready to retire, should we have in the funding a certain dollar amount for proposing a first right of refusal to that property owner, giving him $5,000, make sure that when you're ready to sell, you know, you get an appraisal and the city is paying you for that first right to buy that property.
Anything's
We'd want to
possible.
get in there before Gone or somebody else got in there, right?
Yeah, that was my point on just trying to put something in there so we have some ability to, and we typically would, it seems like, if it's going to be EDA funded, we're pretty good about not spending our complete budget, so there could be something there, but that might be so.
I will look at those properties that we were mentioned tonight and see what approach we need to take to try to.
All right. Anything further for 2023? All right, let's move the conversation on to city updates. Abby, Dan, Patrick, anything for city updates that we haven't already talked about? Just an appropriate of a meeting. All right, Washington County updates. We don't have anything for
I spoke with Chris this morning. He has no updates for tonight's meeting.
Okay. And Leif, I believe you have a chamber update?
Yeah, so Nanette shared some notes here with me today. She was sorry she couldn't be here, but with the golf deadline right around the corner, she was all hands on deck for that. So her update, we welcomed several new businesses with ribbon cuttings and celebrated other momentous events with multiple Forest Lake Chamber members. There's been quite a few of the main chamber members getting involved. 10 new members to the chamber over the last several months.
That's fabulous.
What's that?
That's fabulous.
Yeah, is preparing for the Business Education Day event, where we'll welcome the 2022-2023 new educators to the area. And looking forward to the launch of the What's Next CEO program with our partnership with the Chamber Coalition and Washington County CDA. And last but not least, wrap up final registrations and preparations for the 35th annual Chamber Golf event, one of the Chamber's premier events of the year, which takes place 2 weeks from today.
Perfect. Thank you. And anything else to come before us this evening?
We briefly spoke last time about maybe not having a meeting on that for the.
Oh,
the
I am
golf
so glad you mentioned that.
tournament, just so we can participate, or,
100%.
but if there's a lot of stuff on the agenda, then maybe we should still have a meeting. I guess I don't know.
Let's talk.
That'd be the 25th. You know, basically, as of this point, I don't see anything that can't be held until August, because I mean, that allows us a chance for the downtown plan to be finalized and approved, so we're dealing with a set of knowns at that point, so, you know, looking ahead, I actually didn't have anything really marked for the 25th, but we can all take care of that the first meeting in August, and doesn't affect any timelines.
I would agree. Let's just make that executive decision now that we would have our next meeting on Monday. It'd be Monday, August 8th. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor signal by saying aye. Aye. Oppose, and we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.